everyone, and welcome to the Trial Site News interview series. I'm Erin, your host. Thank you for joining in. And today we will be chatting with Dr. Marco Pravetoni, who is at the University of Washington in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavior Sciences. And he's actually working on a vaccine for opioid addiction. And I believe that's right. And also medication, I think, in general for substance abuse at the news center. There's a new center there. Is that right, Dr. Pravetoni?
Yeah, Erin. Thank you for interviewing me. Yes, the center definitely. Actually was created by the University of Washington by hiring me. And essentially, I'm the new director of the center. And the center was just created essentially January 3rd. That's when I started here at the University of Washington. I spent the last 10 years as a professor at the University of Minnesota Medical School. And I just recently accepted a position here as professor and center director at the University of Washington.
Very interesting. So you introduced yourself basically there. That was my next question. But can you talk a little more specifically about the type of work that you will be doing at this new center?
Yeah, so the type of work we've been doing here will be building on the last 10, 15 years of work that I've been doing throughout all my career. And so the main focus is development of new medications for either treatment or prevention of substance use disorders and drug-related overdose. My group, funded by the National Institute of Health, in the past 10 years have built a pipeline of vaccines that are targeting heroin, oxycodone, synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. And then now we are sort of breaching into other territories such as methamphetamine or cocaine addiction. Through the years, we have built both the science as well as the infrastructure to enable discovery, development, IND enabling studies to seek approval by the Food and Drug Administration and initiate phase 1 clinical trials of novel medications.
So when I was reading about the history of vaccine development for these types of drugs, it took me back to 1974, which I found really surprising because I didn't know about that. So how does that play into what you're doing now? What did that initial research show? And it was on a monkey. I think a monkey was made addicted to heroin and cocaine, a couple things. So multiple substance use disorder there. What did that research show back then? And what has been the progression? Obviously, we haven't seen a vaccine come to fruition, but.
No, that's correct. So back in the 70s, scientists have demonstrated that vaccination could actually reduce the self-administration of heroin in immunized non-human primates, monkeys, as you say. And those early observations sort of open up the field. But at the time, in the 70s and the 80s, especially here in the United States, pharmacotherapies, medications such as methadone and naloxone were approved for treatment of substance use disorders involving opioids. And so at the time, that kind of research didn't really pick up. Later on, probably, I would say in 1990s, to 2000, there was some renowned interest in this approach with groups working on vaccines for cocaine and nicotine addiction that led to an extensive body of literature, so preclinical studies showing efficacy, safety for vaccines targeting drugs of abuse. And that type of research led to clinical trials up to phase 3 of nicotine and cocaine vaccines that show a proof of principle for this approach. But like you just said, no vaccine has been approved yet, or nor is commercially available targeting addiction. And so 20 years later, our group finally received the approval by the FDA to actually start the first phase 1 clinical trial of an opioid vaccine here in the United States. and that clinical trial has been going on for 1 year. It sort of feels like builds on like 40 years of research that finally in the last like 10 years really accelerate this process and moving into the translation and commercialization stage of these vaccines.
Okay, I'm gonna get back to the phase 1 clinical trial, but I wanted to ask you about the research on a vaccine for nicotine addiction, because if I read this correctly, you were involved in some of that and identified possibly a subset of people that it might work in, even though the overall results may not have been promising. Was there a subgroup of people that suggested, oh, they might respond to this, or this vaccine could work in this group? Obviously, we have to do more work.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, that is a great question. So I was not directly per se involved in the clinical trials of nicotine vaccines. That was before my time. But I ended up training early on with somebody who was instrumental in those kind of vaccines. And so when I started early on in this field, I was interested first to understand why certain people develop good responses to these vaccines versus others do not. And so building on those initial nicotine vaccine trials that just showed that so-called good responders or people that have high optimal response against the vaccine, it is possible to achieve efficacy. So I spent like quite of my early career, I guess, like trying to understand why that is. So that the idea is that if we identify biomarkers that would allow us to predict who's going to be a good responder, then will be easier to accelerate development of these vaccines by going directly into the target population rather than trying to immunize everybody without a specific rationale. And usually people think about like vaccines as like something that is given and everybody somehow like develop an optimal immune response. Is not the case with most vaccines. Or if you go outside infectious disease, if you think about the cancer field, is all about biomarkers or identifying who's going to be a good responder to therapy, especially immunotherapies. And so we are applying the same concepts to addiction vaccines. And so we spent quite a bit of time trying to understand if through various multidisciplinary approach, so pharmacology, immunology, and chemistry, we can identify who is going to be a good responder so that building on previous clinical trials, we can design our current clinical trials and hopefully utilize adaptive study design so that we can enroll the ideal patient population, or in future physicians can actually diagnose and enroll and treat the correct subset of patients that will respond to therapy.
So when people think of vaccines today, they obviously think of the COVID-19 vaccines because that's all anybody's talking about. But when you think about a vaccine, you think about infectious disease, you think about targeting an antigen, a virus. But this is a vaccine against a drug or addiction. So can you tell us, how does that work?
Yeah, correct. So most people think about the infectious disease, although in the last several years, like vaccines kind of like took a broader concept, like people develop vaccines against dementia, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And in our case, we are actually targeting small molecules such as drugs of abuse, so compounds like fentanyl, heroin, and so forth. And so since the target drug is a synthetic compound, what we do, given that these compounds are too small to be recognized by the immune system, we take a molecule like fentanyl, if you will, we modify so that can be attached to a larger carrier immunogenic structure that makes it visible to the immune system. And this vaccine is formulated so that it can be given by an injection, just like any other vaccine. So think IM in the deltoid muscle, just like any other vaccine approved on the market these days. And vaccination will trigger the immune response of the patient to develop antibodies that will recognize the target opioid. So upon immunization, the patient will have circulating antibodies that, for instance, will recognize fentanyl, but not any other unrelated molecules. And so once somebody is exposed to fentanyl or deliberately takes fentanyl or similarly structured drug, the antibodies will bind the target drug, that is fentanyl, and prevent its crossing and entering the brain, so that essentially the antibody will reduce the amount or the concentration of drug that gets to the brain, and so will decrease the pharmacological effects of the target drug.
Okay, that makes sense. And how often, I mean, I guess these are questions that haven't been answered yet, but what is your theory on how often someone would have to be immunized if someone has an addiction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough call, because as you know, depending upon what's the type of like patient population you're dealing with, some may benefit from prolonged schedules, other like from like closer schedules, depending upon what's their use patterns. And so right now, since we are just entering in phase 1 trials, we are using a standard regimen that is used to test vaccines of this kind. So we give a primary immunization regimen where we are giving 3 immunizations, so 1 every 3 weeks roughly, and then we follow up with later on like boost. And so we will know through this clinical trial how long the antibodies will last after the last boost, and based upon that, we will be able to determine what's sort of like the boosting schedule. So either it could be something once a year, or every 6 months, or every 3 years. We don't know that. We don't know that.
So the vaccine right now is targeted for one substance.
That's correct. So we have developed a series, my group has developed a series of vaccines. So the first one that entered last year clinical trials is a vaccine targeting oxycodone and related structures such as hydrocodone and so forth, oxymorphone. And then now the plan is to move to the clinical stage a series of other vaccines that were staggered in development. So we have a candidate vaccine targeting fentanyl and related compounds, a vaccine targeting heroin and related metabolites or compounds. And the plan is like to stagger this development so that we demonstrate proof of safety and preliminary efficacy for individual vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
However, sort of the grand plan is like to eventually, before I retire, to come up with a product that will be a multivalent vaccine where multiple opioids can be combined in one formulation.
Wow.
So that potentially somebody can be protected against the effect of mixtures. So very few people use only one type of drug. Most people that purchase drug in the street may encounter mixtures. So let's say heroin, fentanyl, methamphetamine, fentanyl, oxycodone, fentanyl, and so forth. And so our goal is to target a variety of these mixtures so that people can be protected against their pharmacological effects and potential overdosing related side effects.
Now, for some people who don't know or understand clinical trials, phase 1 is where you're testing for safety, figuring out dosing, and you just mentioned that it's been going on for a year? Yeah,
we start October 2020, so a little bit longer than that.
Okay.
So we are still in slow pilot enrollment phase because, as you may appreciate, COVID-19 doesn't really facilitate logistics for inpatients unit and enrollment. And so to guarantee the safety of our staff as well as our patients, and essentially things like slow a bit. But other than that, we are still able to file with the FDA and start a clinical trial. And that essentially opens up the field for us. This was the first time that we got a vaccine into clinical trial. In order to do that, took us a while to build all the infrastructure to actually manufacture the vaccine, run the necessary toxicology studies to obtain FDA approval. And now, starting the phase 1 clinical trial, we have the setup for running more trials. And so essentially that sort of help us to gain momentum. And so the other clinical trials that we're planning will be a little bit accelerated because now we have all the necessary pieces, logistics, regulatory, staff, trained personnel, and
right.
it will facilitate this process.
Now, you did animal studies.
Correct.
Were there any safety concerns, side effects that showed up in the animal studies that were alarming?
For example, current medications, for example, for opioid use disorders, they have issues such as they could be diverted, like could be abuse. They could have abuse liability, or for instance, people can still abuse methadone and overdose on it. Like in contrary, these vaccines, they are, I think they're pretty safe. We never found any side effects, even when we run GLP toxicology, so formal industry standard toxicology studies. We never found anything from a safety perspective. And even from a pharmacological perspective, one of the limitations of current medications that are essentially opioid receptor agonists and antagonists, there is always some issues about interference. So for example, before starting on naltrexone, which is an opioid antagonist, somebody needs to be detoxified. Or there is always the risk that somebody may or may not overdose on some compounds like methadone. Instead, vaccines, being very selective for their target, could be combined with other medications. So for example, our oxycodone vaccine that is in clinical trials does not interfere. It could be potentially combined with methadone, buprenorphine, naltrexone, and naloxone. And so there is no risk of interference because the antibody is not binding these compounds. Or for example, usually physicians or people in general, they ask me about concern about critical care. So for example, our fentanyl vaccine obviously will affect fentanyl pharmacological effects. So patients won't be able to use fentanyl unless it's used at high dose, but all the rest of painkillers or analgesics, painkiller analgesics or anesthetics that could be used, let's say, during surgery or during routine exams could still be used because these antibodies are very selective. And so we are hoping that these vaccines could be a game changer, maybe not per se by themselves, but rather as a combination approach. So we don't really foresee that patients will only be on the vaccine, but rather part of a combination.
Right. Combination. Yeah. Well, and treating addiction is not easy. I mean, it's very, very challenging. And obviously we have the opioid epidemic, and I think it's safe to say that it got worse during COVID-19. You mentioned fentanyl. I think, we saw the overdose deaths from fentanyl have increased. I read every day in my news feed, pharmaceutical companies and legal suits and lawsuits and paying different states for their role in propagating the opioid epidemic. So I think, this type of research is extremely important, and it's very timely. I'm from one of those small towns that was just destroyed by the opioid epidemic, and you saw it in all different elements. So that's why I was personally interested in your research, in terms of high school classmates that I've lost that, you wouldn't think, like people I played on the soccer team with, overdose, dead, grandparents going back to work to raise children because their kids became addicted or their kids overdosed and died. I mean, just the effects are incredible of this epidemic, and drug companies definitely have a role in that. And they do have a responsibility in not letting people know up front, how addicting this medication was. And that was part of this marketing campaign that really misled people. So my question to you is, how much interest do you have in industry and drug companies that want to maybe be part of the solution or help fix this epidemic?
Well, I mean, that's a very difficult question. As a scientist, like you sort of like, I'm not saying that you don't want to be involved in certain aspects, like, it's kind of that political angle. I see that, solving the opioid addiction is a bipartisan, goal. And so regardless of political, parties, etc. And so the same goes like with pharmaceutical companies, like, so I kind of try to stay out of that. And then obviously, one of the limitations for translation of novel therapies, such as vaccines or many other things that are in the pipeline, for example, in academia or small biotech, the key will be like to get enough momentum to move into the commercial space. Otherwise, I could do, a zillion clinical trials, but until a physician is able to prescribe that vaccine to that individual, we will never reach the patients. And so, the model usually, like as you saw COVID this last year, eventually somebody like me will either start a company so that they can get to a point where you get to phase 2, phase 3 advanced product development, or partner up with either government or private stakeholders so that you get to that kind of goal. And so, and I think I don't know, like if coexisting is the right term, but like, opioids are still used therapeutically.
Yeah.
They are a wonderful drug. And so they could be used like for surgery, and so use it correctly with the right education to primary care and physicians, like healthcare, and even like patients themselves, so you don't want to be.
Yeah.
And so that's why also there is like some misperception when we talk about these vaccines. These are not vaccines to essentially blunt all opioids effects so that people cannot use opioids. So the idea is that people can still use opioid when there is a need.
Right.
But the idea is that vaccines will prevent misuse or the toxicity associated with opioids. So that was the goal. So for example, some of the effects of these vaccines are not so much, and not only related to treatment of opioid use disorders, but actually prevention of opioid-induced respiratory depression or bradycardia that are related to overdose. So we are hoping that this will help to actually prevent those overdose that results from accidental exposure to unknown mixtures, or people that they out there using drugs, and and so, and I think that from I guess like from a product standpoint, these vaccines can open up a little bit like the field and understand the concept of how we treat addiction. Or for example, with COVID, lots of people have heard of monoclonal antibodies. So now people, we have two options: you have vaccines and monoclonals, and the same goes for opioids. So we have developed a series of monoclonal antibodies that can be given post-exposure to reverse opioid overdose. So if, let's say, in those situations when somebody is exposed to, let's say, fentanyl or fentanyl analogs, and naloxone, Narcan, that is not necessarily sufficient to reverse the overdose, we are open to bring to the field monoclonals that can be combined with Narcan, so that somebody can be rescued easily than just like receiving Narcan, and can reduce their hospitalization
right.
So.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and they're putting fentanyl in all sorts of things on the street. I've been reading that in almost every state. So it's really concerning, but I appreciate you making that point that lots of people do use opioids, and they need them and they're fine. And certainly this isn't for that type of use. For anybody who's interested in learning more about your research, where can they go?
Well, I guess these days, if you Google my name and the University of Washington, University of Minnesota,
Google works.
And so, sorry, it's not to make a joke, but like,
no, it's fine.
So yeah, I'm happy to send you the link to our center. And then obviously, as you may appreciate, some links are more to technical literature directed more to an academic audience, but then also we have, I have done either interviews or I guess I have lately, especially have a bit of a presence in podcast or resources that will allow to connect, just like you say. We want to get out of academia. We don't just want to stay here itself. I mean, this is where some of the science grow, but the only way to reach out is to talk to people,
right?
To patients, talking to physicians, talking to investors.
Right. You have to get your research to the market. There's lots of steps involved in that. Yeah.
Otherwise, we'll never treat. So I mean, and it gets incredibly complex. Obviously, our research is paid by the government, by NIH, and so I think that also, taxpayers, should get their money back. So if we develop something, they should, get it back in form of a product that we give to patients.
Ideally, that they can afford, right?
I think that's the old game, and so it's that is always my goal. So.
Well, there are lots of people on trial site who are interested in research and bringing new things to market. So hopefully, who knows, maybe somebody will be interested in this particular topic. It certainly is timely, and it has the potential to help a lot of people out there. So.
Yeah, no, I appreciate, sometimes after conversations like this, some of my collaborators sometimes were random cold calls. They say, well, I saw you on this journal, whatever. We have this new, technology for vaccine delivery. We'd like to test it. And so I'm always I'm always open to talk with pretty much anybody about research and how to collaborate or find a way to work together. So.
Well, that's fantastic. That's what Trial Site is all about, research.
Thank
you. Please come back anytime, share results, any new research ideas. We're happy to cover it. And best of luck with everything.
Well, thank you so much. And then don't hesitate to reach out if you need more questions or if you need, a picture of the lab or some B-roll or
picture of the lab, maybe a tour. I mean, like I said, I'm really interested in this type of stuff just because, the opioid epidemic has affected me personally so much. And so I'm always looking for how people are, trying to go about addressing it. And so that's why when I read an article about you, it caught my attention. And I said, this is, I definitely want to reach out to him and hear more about this. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and geographically, it's always, before I was in Minnesota, and obviously Minnesota has their own problem with drug addiction, whether it's methamphetamine, fentanyl, etc. Now, as soon as I moved here in Washington, I realized that in the Pacific Northwest, that's also even more of an emerging problem. And the other day I was talking with somebody in Vancouver and how in British Columbia now, I guess 90% of overdose deaths were related to fentanyl. And, we're talking about a state that is just here, is Canada, but it's just across the border here from Seattle. And so geographically, these things or all the Appalachian, it's crazy how so which region are you from, if you don't mind?
I'm in Northeast, but yeah, I'm originally from a really small town in Pennsylvania. So, and it was, all of Pennsylvania, these tiny rural towns got hit really hard. But, the leadership is really trying to address the problem and come up with creative ways. But fentanyl is kind of a new, it's always been around, but the rate, of use and overdose, it's terrifying, because it doesn't take much to kill you, really. I was wondering why, or what they're going to do with fentanyl testing strips. I thought that would be a good idea to get them to go mainstream, but I know that there's different opinions about that.
Yeah, that's something me. I spent the last 20 years in the United States, and I'm a U.S. citizen, but I'm originally from Italy, and in Europe, there are places where I guess, I don't know if you would consider more liberal, but like, in Germany or Switzerland, they give essentially clean cocaine or methamphetamine to cocaine and methamphetamine users, with the idea behind that, they purchase the same drug, but from their physician, and so it would be safer.
Yeah.
Here in the state of Washington, there is a program that does a free needle exchange as well. I just learned the other day, they give out of free like glass pipes to methamphetamine users so they can smoke with essentially a clean pipe. And I don't think it's so much to promote obviously drug use, but to provide people more
Right.
like, it's like harm reduction with tools.
Harm reduction, right,
Yeah.
right.
So,
Yeah, and that's it's an interesting area of research, and people feel strongly on all sides of those issues. Yeah, I don't know if that will ever go mainstream or not, but or what the right answer is. I really don't. I think from what I've read, it seems like harm reduction is a good cost-effective solution. But I think they need a lot more research on that, and some communities feel differently about that, depending on.
Sure, that will have even more political connotation than just like new medications for opioids.
Yeah, that's a political pipe bomb, like just ready to so but
right.
Anyways, thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I look forward to sharing this, and best of luck with phase 1 of that trial.